Hey guys, how's it going? Ghosty Rich here today, and today we're going to be talking about building engines. Always fun, right? Well, I've had a few people asking me, Rich, how do you choose the parts out? I'm trying to find some myself, things that you consider when building the motor. I'm going to try and keep it as brief as I can. There are some really good channels on YouTube like Driver's Boot Camp for number one. If you're looking at any of these parts I'm going to mention, go and he capitalizes to the maximum on everything that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to flip the camera around and I'm going to show you some parts because I have a motor that is all taken apart right now. Let's first talk about the first rotational assembly that everybody focuses on, and that would be your piston, rod, and your crank. So you might want to automatically jump into, well, Rich, we already know all that. Forged is the best. Not always. Let's quickly go into this. First off, the lightest but most durable block is best. A lot of people isn't going to spend a lot of money on this, but I'm just going to still mention it. If you have a local shop that can machine your block, go ahead and do that. If not, you can, of course, purchase it from somewhere out of town, but then you got to pay shipping, and if it's in another country, duties and all that other stuff. So it might be a lot better for you just to take this block to somebody local, and when you're getting the block done, they'll dip it, they'll clean it up, and then they'll machine the any casting issues. And then the last thing they'll do is, of course, if you ask them, they'll hone the cylinder. Super important because it just cleans and gives you a nice new surface. Let's go to the piston. The piston expands and contracts with heat. If this is your daily driver and you drop forged pistons in there, what will end up happening is you'll have a very big expansion ratio, and what you'll get is something called piston slap as your engine warms up every time you start it from a cold start. Yes, once it warms up, they're beautiful, but when you do cold starts, they do a lot of wear. What happens is these skirts turn sideways like this because there's too much movement, and they slap these cylinder walls and actually cause wear prematurely on the cylinder wall. So unless you're going to be racing this motor and rebuilding it every season, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Also, what are you doing with this motor? You're just going to throw a little bit of boost in there? Or are you going to throw twin turbos in here? What are you doing? Because to tell you the truth, if you just want something that's going to go really quick, maybe you're going to throw a little bit of PSI in here, it might not be worth it. So make sure you do your research. You might want to just go with a really good cast piston and call it a day. Now, don't get me wrong, still do forged rods. Forged rods rock. You can go ahead and do those, and they're probably just as much as OEM, and they're going to be way stronger. So definitely stick with new forged rods. It's going to lighten up the rotational assembly a little bit, which is nice. Most cranks that you buy nowadays are going to be forged. So don't really worry too much about that. I mean, yes, some are going to be lighter. So go ahead if you want to make that big expenditure, but don't focus too much on it. It's still going to be heavy. Depending on the vehicle, you can still get some that have shaved a little bit of weight. But again, when you're buying a new crank, you get new rods, and if you're pulling the pistons, you're going to redo the rings. I would highly suggest what you do is you buy a balanced setup, meaning that you buy it new, and the place that you're buying it from, they balance your setup with a crank, so that way you've got new bearings, you've got your new rods, and you've got your new pistons, and then all that needs to be done are the rings. The rings have to be done to your block. You can't simply just go and buy these things and not do your rings afterwards. I'm not going to go too much into it, but what you need to do is you need to grab a piston ring grinder, and what it's going to do is you're going to be slowly grinding a little bit of your ring off at a time. Then you take a feeler gauge from like what you would use for a spark plug gap tester, but you use it for your rings, and you basically put it into the cylinder and you set it for if you're boosting or naturally aspirated. Again, this is something you have to check with what your end objective is. if you're wondering what I'm talking about, naturally aspirated means no turbos, no supercharger. You're just running what you brung. And you try to make this as light as you can. You try to give it as much air as you can. And you're on for a good ride. There's nothing wrong with a naturally aspirated build. Usually you won't get close to forced induction, but reliability's there and you have less heat to deal with. Anyways. Once again, if you're doing naturally aspirated, I would probably still try to stay away from forged only because of the fact that one, it's not going to get as hot quicker, and you're not really going to gain as much other than a little bit of weight savings from the rotational assembly. If you're daily driving this or going to drive it a lot, it doesn't equate for the amount of wear in rebuilding this motor. Again, you're probably wondering, Rich, well, really, what are we going to be dealing with? I'm talking like 30,000 kilometers you're rebuilding your motor because you have to get it honed. Now, that being said, if you have a friend or a machinist that's willing to come to your house, or you're going to take it to their house, it means they just have to pop the heads off, and they'll have to pop your oil pan off, and they'll have to drop your pistons out, and they'll have to hone the cylinder, and you'll have to redo new rings to the honed cylinder. But it's a lot of maintenance, and it's something you have to look forward to. So something to think about. That's rotational assembly number one. Piston is going up and down the cylinder, little bit lighter weight. But then, so Rich, what else do we have to look at? Well, we have to look at fuel, which has a lot to do with this rotational assembly. Although that kind of goes into both hand in hand, you still need to figure out, okay, for fuel and air. Fuel, you can buy bigger injectors, so it gets a little bit more fuel into the cylinders. For example, this is for this Corvette right here. They're known to be dogs on fuel, meaning that they need better fueling right off the get-go. So with better fuel comes more expensive upgrades, aka injectors ain't cheap. Also, then you have to get those injectors fuel, meaning new fuel pump, yay! Again, that can cost just as much as a rotational assembly for your vehicle. Next, we have our lifters. Our lifters sit right here. Now, if you don't know how an engine works, basically, I'm going to draw it out like this for you. You got your pistons going up and down. Well, then you have your valves that are opening and closing, letting air in, and then after combustion, letting gas out. So, how we control that is with the spring and the valves opening and closing, which is done by the camshaft, our second rotational assembly. So the lifter rides up the cam lobe, pushes on a rod, if it's a push rod. If not, it might be one where the cam just rolls and lifts the lifter. What happens at, or also known as a rocker, because what you have is the rocker, which, well, can you guess it, rocks up, which pushes the valve open. So imagine a stick pushing up on one end of a seesaw, and the seesaw pushes down the valve, which opens it up. So changing your cam changes the air and exhaust sound. Now, again, this is for performance reasons, and it can also change how your vehicle sounds. If you don't believe me, go and listen to different cams on YouTube, and you can see how it transforms a vehicle. Heck, I have a Hemi Jeep out there, and I shoved a 6.4 cam in there. Every time I pull up to another 5.7, everyone goes, "What have you done to that thing?" Well, I shoved a 6.4 cam in it. I also did some stuff to the exhaust, but again, you can change notes of the exhaust and everything just by changing out your cam. And also, some cams give really nice horsepower. I mean, that one gave me 60 to 70 horsepower naturally aspirated, which is big horsepower gains for naturally aspirated. Anyways, we've gone ahead, we've gone over that. So again, lifter rides up the cam lobe, and then as it rides up the cam lobe, it then opens the valve, and then as it goes down after the peak over here, it closes the lobe. So, closes the valve, but it goes off the lobe. Cam is one thing that you can do. Another thing is you want good lifters. The reason why is, depending, if you look up your engine, it might be just like the Hemis have, they fail from lifter failure. Start getting misfires and stuff like that. Definitely make sure you look at getting one that has strong needle bearings, so that way you have a good solid lifter. And don't cheap out on them. Don't just go on Amazon or eBay and buy some lifters. Buy some nice ones with some nice needle bearings, because if those fail, then you get to tear Humpty Dumpty all apart again. So don't cheap out on the lifters or anything with bearings. Ta-da. From there, now that you've kind of understand that, why cam is one of the items that I'm going to recommend that you can do for building your engine. And what's the best part is you don't technically have to take apart your whole short block. Technically, you just have to pull the heads off, engine can remain in the vehicle, and you gain a really nice amount of power without even having to pop out the rotational assembly. Because the moment you start going deeper and deeper into a motor build, the number one thing people always forget about is you need gaskets. So the deeper you go, the more gaskets you need, which costs you more. Again, if you're doing naturally aspirated build, something that you might want to do, and what others do, is they look at putting a smaller gasket on for a tighter compression ratio. Now, you've probably heard that before. Well, what does compression have to do with the different build that I want to do? Supercharged and turbocharged, you're going to want a little bit less compression. And the reason why is to account for the heat and, of course, the forced induction. For example, your piston rings are going to be gapped tighter for higher compression for naturally aspirated, but for turbocharged and supercharged, you're going to leave a little bit more room, so that way a little bit more pressure can be relieved just in those high pressure moments, so your motor doesn't dynamite. That's the best way to put it. Again, that's also for heat, because like I said, it's going to cause extreme heat, and if your ring doesn't have enough gap in there, it'll keep heating up, and then it'll get too close together. You'll have extreme compression, or in worst case scenario, it'll be pressing together, which is why if you're going to turbocharge or supercharge a motor like this, it's not a Z06, this was a Grand Sport. It was not designed to be supercharged. You need to address the rings, because the rings will be gapped too close together and you will suffer from engine failure, or piston ring failure, best way to put it. All right, we've gone into piston rings, we've gone into the cam. So cam, yes, again, do yourself some forged rods if you want. Pistons, again, depending on use. And forged crank, it's already usually forged. All you're gonna really be deciding on is if you want to try and find a crank that's a little bit lighter for lighter rotational assembly. Moving on, bearings. Once again, there's bearings in the piston rods, there's bearings in the main journals right here. You want to make sure that you replace those bearings as well, especially when you're buying your balance setup. If you're going to do that, don't buy anything until you have your motor apart. Biggest thing ever. You need to measure the bore so you get proper pistons. There's a tool for it. It kind of expands out, and so that way you can tell what bore you have. Also, since you're going to go get your block machine, they'll measure it and they'll tell you the size of piston you need. Don't just say, hey, I'm going to build my motor next week, and go and start ordering parts, and then they all arrive and they're all wrong, because your machinist will just laugh at you. And then, yeah, do it once. Do it right. It might take you a little longer, but it's worth it. You don't really need to do much in here other than valve springs. And if you want rockers, for example, there's an upgrade for the lifter rocker right here. The rocker's up here, the lifter is in the block itself. Your lifters go right in here. Again, riding that cam, trying to make sure I press that in. The lifter rolls up the cam, presses up a push rod. So when you're shopping for push rods, that's what it means. And then comes up here, pushes the rocker presses down, pushing the valve open. As it rides back up, this goes back up, the valve spring closes the valve. Make sure that if you upgrade your cam, that your valve springs are going to work. When you're in here, replace your valve seals that are in here. You might as well, especially if you have a high kilometer motor, so you can put in the new valve seals and you can get your valves again inspected by your machinist, and he'll clean this all up, and then he'll tell you if you need new seats. Hopefully you don't. Either way, intake side looks pretty. Exhaust side is always dirty, which is fine. Again, you're going to get this cleaned up and dipped, so that way it's all shiny again. And if you have the rocker that's up here, the only upgrade you can do is some, like the 3.6 Pentastar, have failure of rockers. So make sure, again, these have bearings in them. There is a true union trunnion, I guess is what they would call it, a trunnion upgrade for, let's say, this LT1. So I'm going to definitely be doing that. And that, of course, fixes the needle bearing issue. That's another big one. So again, rockers, don't cheap out on. Lifters, don't cheap out on. Push rods, chances are you're not going to have to upgrade them. But a lot of the cam kits do come with new push rods, so you can go ahead and use them. And then, last but not least, especially for these V8s now, notice how there is a bunch of stanchions that are there. What that's for is known as AFM, MDS, blah, 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 all different fuel management systems. You need to, before you remove this, check with your local state. I don't want anyone getting in trouble here, but if you can, it's all about smiles per gallon to me, not miles per gallon. I'm Canadian, so it's kilometers per liter. Doesn't sound as cool. Anyways, I delete V4 mode or 4-cylinder mode or 4-cylinder deactivation fuel savings mode on every engine. Why? It deals with a collapsible lifter. So rather than having a solid lifter that's rolling up and down your cam, what happens is it actually comes with one with a little, if you're looking at a collapsible lifter, it has a little dot in it. Fills up with fuel, or not fuel, oil, sorry. And it collapses down. And what ends up happening after it collapses, the cylinder no longer works saving you fuel. Now, what's the problem with this? Well, there's actually multiple problems. One, these lifters can fail. After they fail, then you're tearing Humpty Dumpty apart to deal with it. And two, it's actually very hard on some cases like this vehicle on the torque tube and the transmission and the torque converter. What ends up happening is every time it jumps in from 4 and 8 mode, it jumps and jolts the transmission, causing a whole bunch of vibration. Vibration is the enemy of your engine. Anyways, it vibrates and jumps everything, goes all the way back to your torque converter, burns out your torque converter. Later on, will also do damage to the seals inside your torque tube, will also do damage to the axle, blah, 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 blah. Life goes on, the beat goes on. It's a really cool concept, but the things that you have to look at is it's going to cause wear and tear every time it kicks in and out, because in the end, it's like instantaneously like a bang of power, and then when it cuts out, it just shuts off 2 cylinders. So you just have to weigh the pros and cons, and do you need that fuel savings? If you do, you should have bought a 4-cylinder. No, I'm kidding. But anyways, that's another thing. If you go ahead and you're like, I'm going to delete my MDS system, just keep in mind, you need new lifters. You need to get a different cam, which there's beautiful cams on the market. So that's not like it's a bad thing, and you're going to gain horsepower. So might as well do it while you're in there. New lifters, new cam, and new valve springs. And then chances are they're going to give you push rods. You're going to get new head gaskets. Lots of little things. Now, another cool thing. Another thing that people probably don't think about when they're first modifying an engine. See those bad boys right there, the head gaskets? That's another upgrade, believe it or not. If you're going to be doing forced induction, you might want to lower your compression ratio. A good way to do this is to actually put thicker head gaskets in. By doing so, you can get a different compression ratio, which might be closer to what you're looking for your build. Again, if this is your first build, definitely bring on an expert. There are going to be things that you didn't think about, especially when it comes to compression ratios. And I just don't want to see you, blow up your first project. I mean, if it's a cheap one, like you're building up a 94 Civic, you're going to see how much boost you can take. have at her. Man, play with compression ratios, see what she can do, throw forged pistons in, who cares? You can grab buddy guy and lift that darn engine out with a broom handle if you wanted to. You can rebuild it on a weekend. But something like if you're messing with a V8, Challenger, Charger, Hemi, anything like that with a big V8, let's wrap this up. I know I just rambled on for pretty much 16 minutes straight, but I'm really big on trying to be thorough with this. Another couple small upgrades for you. When you're messing with this, if you're reading up and there's valve oil failure, or you're dealing with a lifter failure and stuff like that, two things you can do to help out with that. One, you can look to see if there's an upgraded oil pump available. Go ahead and get the upgraded oil pump. That way you can pump more oil up into the top end, because that's the thing with these overhead cams these days. You want to make sure that you're getting enough oil into the top of the motor to oil everything, and there's no better way to do it than with a better oil pump. You might sacrifice a little bit of power depending, but it's worth it. Also, when you're looking at cams, depending on your goals too, and if you don't want to try and have to dial in cams, I would highly suggest another thing is to keep your VVT, or I forget what they call it for this one. It might be VVT. It's probably not, but it has a phaser and all that other fun stuff. You can try and keep that as well. The other fun thing is if you have dual overhead cams, like this has a single cam. If you have what's known as dual overhead cams, so a cam for each side, then what you'd end up needing is two cams when you do an upgrade, which can be fun. It's also a good time to do your timing chain depending on the kilometers of your motor, or if you have a timing belt, definitely do it. There's no bad time to do a timing belt. Anyways, I hope that kind of went through everything. First off, quick couple ones. Machine the block, machine the heads if you're going this deep. What are you doing? If you're going to go ahead and be racing this motor, you're building a track car, forge it. Forge everything. Daily driver, don't do the pistons. Leave the pistons. They will take too long to warm up. You'll get piston slap during warm up every morning that you start this thing. Definitely do a cam. You might not need to do a crank depending on the kind of build that you're doing. Oil pump, lifters, and rockers. That's basically it. Make sure you clean everything up. The unsung hero, make sure if you're going to spend all this money, get yourself a nice set of headers so that way you can get airflow down to the end of the car. And yeah, that's basically it. Be ready to break in your motor, have lots of smiles per gallon, and that's about it for me, man. I highly recommend that you go and look up every single part you are curious about. Study, study, study. So that way you have all this knowledge. Go back to school, write it down, and that way you get to learn all over again. I mean, that's the fun of building the motor. If you're not enjoying doing it, then why do it? Like, you might as well go pay someone else to do it and let them get all their hands all cut up and stuff like that. Anyways, thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Press like if it helped you out, and subscribe for more. And again, a channel that I highly recommend. If you type in, I think it's called Drivers Boot Camp or something like that. He is a very knowledgeable man, and he's spent a lot of time going through editing his videos, and I've sent so many people to go learn about the different procedures for every different engine, because he has a lot of fun doing it and he has passion for it. Perfect. That's where we're going to end this. Like if it helped you out, subscribe for more, and race on. When upgrading power, also consider the fact when you're doing your build sheet, differentials, for example, if you're building a Jeep, and of course, other supporting things like we still have axles in cars like this. You need to know that your diff's going to take it. What is your transmission rated for? Make sure you do all of this. Usually it's rated by torque, not horsepower, because torque is how hard you hit the wall, And horsepower is how fast you hit it. Horsepower, you might just hit that wall and the wall's still there. Torque means you'll hit the wall and you'll take that wall 100 feet with you. One last thing to bring up with you guys. Software. Everyone also doesn't look at this next to gaskets. When you go and after you rebuild a motor and you go to put it in, take the time, take it to a dyno. Don't just buy some pre-made tune. Trust me, it makes all the difference. So make sure once you get it all in, check and see before you even start the car. If the guy says, hey, yeah, it's safe to drive down here. And if you get the okay, drive it down. If not, account for a tow. Just do it. And then after you do that, go get it tuned. And man, you might have a rocket on your hands.